to Mintcast, an interview series featuring dissenting voices the establishment would rather silence. I'm your host, Manar Mohawish Adli. To help us continue these interviews, you can become a member on our Patreon page, which we will link in the video below. Now, Edward Snowden has called it the story of the year. An Israeli spying company has been caught selling software to authoritarian regimes who have used it to surveil more than 50,000 people worldwide. And on that list include many leading investigative journalists, as well as heads of state, including French President Emmanuel Macron, Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan, and President of Iraq, Barham Salih. But the Israeli cyber spying industry goes far beyond what was revealed earlier this week. Investigative journalist Whitney Webb has just published another article with Mint Press about a much more worrying piece of Israeli software that makes Pegasus look tame by comparison. Now, Whitney is here today to talk to me about this. She's a writer and researcher for her own outlet, Unlimited Hangout, and a contributor to The Last American Vagabond. Between 2017 and 2020, she was also a senior investigative reporter for Mint Press. Welcome back, Whitney.
Hey, great to be on. Thanks for having me.
So first, I would like to get your reaction to the news about this Pegasus leak that dropped on Sunday and is continuing to come out each day now. What parts of the story really struck you, and what do you think is not being covered by the mainstream corporate media?
Okay, so the abuse of the Pegasus software by NSO Group clients is nothing new. We've known about this in a big way since at least 2018, when Amnesty International and a Canadian group called Citizen Lab became very vocal about it. And then at the time, also Edward Snowden, who you just mentioned, was very vocal about it at the time. There was another controversy with NSO Group a year later regarding a hack or a hacking tool that they had developed that was targeting WhatsApp, the popular messaging service. So this is something that has brought NSO Group notoriety over the years and has even led potential purchasers of their company, like the Blackstone Group, to back out after outrage. So the abuse of Pegasus software by governments, including authoritarian governments, around the world is something that's been known for a long time. So that isn't really the new part of the revelations, but just because of the crazy news cycle, especially in the last year and a half, some people may have forgotten or may not have heard of it on those previous occasions. The interesting thing I would say about these revelations is that it is the scope that we now know of in terms of this list that was acquired by Amnesty International and this French nonprofit that was then given to a variety of media outlets who are covering this. It's about 50,000 people are on the list, including, as you mentioned, several heads of state, journalists, human rights activists, dissidents, and whatnot. So I think, we've known before that it's been used to spy on people. I think it's the scope here, the sheer number of people that are now admitted to have been targeted with the software by a variety of governments and regimes is what is essentially new here, as well as the fact that, heads of state are, now confirmed, at least some of them, to have been targeted with this software. So one thing, there's several things that aren't being covered here. One is that NSO Group and Pegasus is just one product of what is sometimes referred to as the lawful intercept market, which are essentially offensive hacking tools that are sold to different clients around the world. They don't have a monopoly on that market. So there are other products that do similar things. And so, like, for example, Edward Snowden in his recent comments on this case has called for that entire brand of products to be outlawed in its entirety, but that message has not been picked up by mainstream media. Another thing that's been very obvious, a very glaring omission by mainstream media, is the mention that NSO Group was founded by veterans of the Israeli Military Signal Intelligence Unit, Unit 8200, and that aspects of that company have enduring ties to the Israeli national security state, as well as the fact that Israel's Ministry of Defense has some responsibility for the sale of Pegasus to all of these governments, because they licensed the sale of NSO Group software as an Israeli company in this particular field to those governments. And without that approval, those sales would not have been able to take place. So Israel has essentially been absolved At least the Israeli state and intelligence service has been absolved of this, but this is pretty significant when you consider that Unit 8200 is basically like the NSA of the US or GCHQ in the UK. They're well known to abuse their surveillance capabilities, specifically in occupied Palestine, where they're known to blackmail people. They, of course, claim publicly that it's to prevent terrorism and crime and stuff like that, but numerous documented cases of them using it just to persecute people for their political beliefs or for their activism, or in an attempt to weaken Palestinian society and turn it against itself. And there have actually been veterans of that unit that have refused to go along with those abuses. So that's one of the reasons that we know about them. But the fact that this is being omitted as part of this major scandal, I think, is pretty significant.
Absolutely. And we're going to talk more about Unit 8200. And also, I'm curious to know about the people, the veteran intelligence people that refused to participate in this sort of spyware. Can you talk more about them?
Well, it happened several years ago. It was several veterans from Unit 8200 that basically came out, and it was reported on Israeli media and to a lesser extent in international media, openly saying that Unit 8200 was engaging in blackmail against civilian Palestinians not suspected of a crime for purposes that they thought were immoral, and called for like an ethics committee to be established, among other things. It's not clear if that actually ever happened. Probably not. But it for the time, I forget exactly what year it took place, was in the last couple of years, did break into the media for a little bit. So, this is a documented practice that it has even been admitted by former members in such a public way, who came out and demanded the government change its tactics.
Right. And so for all the press coverage that Pegasus is getting, another product possibly far more worrying called Toka, which you have just written a very impressive and lengthy investigation on Mint Press News, has received almost no attention. Now, if you're watching this, please go to mintpressnews.com and where you can find Whitney's investigation. But can you tell us what exactly is Toka, and why do you claim it is worse than Pegasus?
So Toka is the company. So like they're the equivalent of NSO Group, right? They're another Israeli spyware company. But yes, they haven't gotten any attention at all. And we don't even actually know the name of their products. They claim that they can essentially develop software from scratch to hack any device that their clients ask them to, their clients being expressly foreign governments, law enforcement agencies, and intelligence agencies around the world. So their clientele is very similar to NSO Group in terms of Pegasus in that sense. But what's concerning about Toka is that they openly admit that they work very closely with Israeli intelligence services and the Israeli military to, quote unquote, enhance their products, whereas the NSO Group, publicly anyway, is a private company with no overt ties to the Israeli national security state. Toka admits to having those direct and persisting ties from its founding in 2018 to the present. We also don't know the extent to which these sales have been taking place, and they also offer to essentially design offensive cyber strategies and services for these same clients that they service, which are essentially foreign governments as well. And basically any government that's deemed friendly to Israel can be a customer, but they have openly said that they will not be offering their services to countries that they deem enemies. And on that list, according to their CEO at the time, it was Russia and China. He named directly, but we can assume, of course, that would include Iran, probably Syria, and various governments around the world that have that are either very supportive of Palestine, have declined to normalize relations with Israel, among other things. So it's essentially has the potential, we can talk about this later, it appears it has been weaponized to be an instrument of Israeli foreign policy to a certain degree as well. So in terms of its capabilities itself, besides purporting to be able to hack any device, they have a special focus, they admit, on Internet of Things devices and in essentially any consumer electronic device. So in the case of Pegasus software, this targets expressly smartphone devices in a variety of ways. Basically, through Pegasus, you can gain access to anything on someone's phone, and you can also remotely record their phone calls, turn on the microphone to make recordings recordings or the camera to do so. Toka has their products have all of these capabilities, but not just with smartphones, with any device, and not even limited to smartphones or computers. They say, even connected fridges, Amazon Echoes, Google Nest products, anything connected to the internet, essentially, including alarms in people's homes. They can give their clients access to these devices and allow them also to be manipulated in the case of Internet of Things devices. And this is also very concerning because they openly market their software as to be used in covert operations, meaning that in the case of like the alarms, for example, if there was a covert operation to take place by one of these clients, they can disable the alarm system of a residence of someone they want to raid and then go in undetected or something like that. And, their sales pitch is very similar to NSO Group's sales pitch for Pegasus, that, this is only sold to governments to go after terrorists and to go after serious criminals and all of this. But of course, we know from this recent scandal that is hardly the case once this gets into the hands of these foreign governments and foreign intelligence agencies. It's consistently and systematically abused. So it's very likely that Toka's software will be the case. It experiences, it's the same situation because you're giving essentially unlimited power to spy on people. And of course, as I've covered in my work on Jeffrey Epstein, blackmail is really the currency of a lot of these intelligence agencies. It's been used by, as we just talked about, Israel's own signal intelligence agency. So, the potential for that is also very concerning as well. And so, keeping the discussion expressly focused on NSO Group prevents us from talking about how this market in its entirety is a major problem. But Toka, I think, is one specifically deserving of attention because it has direct ties to a government is selling the same product that goes even farther than Pegasus does. We don't know its client list of governments because they don't say so, but they actively market their services to the government of the United States, to France. They're currently trying to get more involved with developing countries for various reasons. And they have a partnership with the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank to do that. So this is definitely a company that I think deserves people's attention.
Okay, so you talked about a lot of things here that I want to break it down a little bit into simplified terms so the average person can understand the significance of this. And we'll get, we're going to get to all of those aspects, but let's break it down one by one, okay? First, I want to know how this affects the average person. I mean, we know that this is being used to target journalists, human rights activists, even heads of state, like you laid out. Does this affect the average person with their smartphone?
Well, it potentially could because we don't know. So right on this list of 50,000 people, only a few of those have been identified that have come out. So we don't really know how far this goes. And of course, if you consider current U.S. policy with regard to their domestic terror strategy and this pivot towards domestic extremism, that strategy very heavily relies on electronic communications, social media, things like that, including communications that are stored on a smartphone. It talks about targeting encryption, which is, what Pegasus and this other software offers a workaround for. So it can very easily be abused on a wider scale, and governments around the world, not just the United States, are gearing up to do that if they aren't already doing it. And for people that think that the Biden administration's domestic terror policy, as they publicly claim, is going to be expressly focused on white supremacists, I would encourage you to actually go and read the text of the strategy itself, because therein it says that the people they consider extremists or anyone they deem to be anti-authority, anti-government, as well as people who oppose capitalism, which, of course, in the history of the United States, they will easily apply that to socialists if they wish. And once this type of infrastructure is established, let's say a Republican gets in office, they could easily weaponize it against their political opponents. Once you have the infrastructure established, it's very hard to remove once it's there. And so these are the types of tools that basically gut any sort of privacy enhancing technologies that are available to consumers. And since we're living in this context of wide ranging surveillance and abuse of that surveillance, especially in the United States in the post 9/11 era, and with this new signaling from the US government that they're going to step it up even further, I think this is something that should concern everyone.
Absolutely. And that's what I was going to ask about next, is how will this be used and weaponized against dissent and any sort of person who opposes, capitalist ideologies, neoliberalism, war policies? How is this going to affect independent journalists like myself or yourself? And so I think that makes a lot of sense. So my next question for you, to also break down that explanation that you gave, is how is Israel using these spyware softwares to weaponize their agenda and to also push their foreign policy around the world?
Okay, so there's two different angles through which Israel's government and national security state attempt to leverage their cybersecurity and high-tech sector. One involves basically proliferating the presence of companies founded by veterans of the Israeli national security state, having them embedded in larger multinational or acquired by multinational corporations, having them contract to foreign governments or to powerful entities in different countries and whatnot, as a way to directly counter boycott, divest sanctions in such a way that various countries become so reliant on technology produced by either veterans or previously produced and then commercialized by the Israeli national security state that they will be unable to boycott Israel in its entirety. And Israel has Netanyahu, when he was in power, expressly said that this was part of Israel's cyber strategy as a way to combat BDS. And then you have people from AIPAC and Netanyahu's top economic advisor partnered with the neocon billionaire in the US, Paul Singer, to create something called Startup Nation Central that's was expressly founded on that idea to combat BDS as a way of getting US companies to acquire Israeli companies for that explicit purpose. So in the context of Startup Nation Central, this isn't exclusively technology companies, but it does have a focus on them. The other policy that people need to be aware of started, as far as we know, in terms of what they've admitted, started the same year that Startup Central was created, but it's slightly different. So if it's okay, I'll just read from this article. Because it was covered in Israeli media in 2018. It didn't get any coverage in international media, but it is honestly quite scandalous. And it's based on interviews with high-ranking former and current Israeli military and intelligence officials. The article passed through the Israeli military censor, which prevented them from naming some of the individuals, even that gave on-record interviews in some of the companies involved. But because of that, we know that this is essentially an admitted policy because it was approved for publication by the Israeli military itself. So it was published in Calculus Tech, and it opens as follows. It says, Israel is siphoning cyber-related activities from its national defense apparatus to privately held companies. Since 2012, cyber-related and intelligence products that were previously carried out in-house in the Israeli military and Israel's main intelligence arms are transferred to companies that in some cases were built for this exact purpose. The description of the processes that took place in Israel in recent years, presented in the following article, I already said that, sorry, are based on all these interviews with high-ranking officials, people at cybersecurity and intelligence companies, as Israel's Ministry of Defense held since 2017. So essentially what they're admitting there is that since 2012, companies in this particular sector in Israel are basically conducting operations that were previously conducted by groups like Mossad, Shin Bet, or Unit 8200, essentially operating as fronts for Israeli intelligence. Of course, because this article prevents any of them from being named, we don't know exactly what those companies are, but the proliferation of tech companies founded by Unit 8200 veterans after that year is quite concerning. And for example, one of these companies that I wrote about for Mint Press in January of last year, Cyber Reason, their Unit 8200 veteran, co-founder and CEO, openly describes his work at Cyber Reason as being a, quote, continuation of his time at Unit 8200. And when he was at Unit 8200, he led offensive hacking operations against nation states. So that's quite significant. And Cyber Reason is currently, its software is being run on US government computers, including for the US military. I think that should be quite significant. You know, if we really are concerned about the use of Israeli spyware, why not talk about this company? Why is it just being limited to NSO Group? So basically, you have two different angles here. You have Israel saying that it wants to use these tech companies explicitly with the purpose of countering Palestine solidarity with Palestine around the world, and also using them to conduct classified intelligence and defense operations, but they're operating publicly as private companies, some of them with no obvious ties necessarily to the Israeli national security state. But this honestly requires investigations of any government into any sort of cyber security or technology company that fits this bill. And so a lot of companies, as I mentioned, we mentioned earlier how NSO Group was created by veterans of Unit 8200. Cyber Reason is one. There's tons of these companies. Microsoft's entire cloud structure for its Azure cloud is based off of one company founded by a Unit 8200 graduate, Asaf Rappaport. His company was Adalon and was acquired by them. And they nearly had the contract to run the entire cloud for the Pentagon recently. It's amazing there's no discussion of this. And this is very concerning when you consider past incidents with Israel trying to actually attacking a U.S. naval ship in order to blame it on an Arab country and get the U.S. into a war that Israel wanted, back with the USS Liberty incident, and also historic Israeli espionage cases that targeted the U.S. government, including classified installations like the Promise software scandal or the espionage that took place with the Jonathan Pollard affair in the 1980s, or honestly, you also have the situation with Israeli tech companies Amdocs and Converse Infosys, which were the subject of actually a mainstream media investigation in the aftermath of 9/11 for basically having this massive spy ring targeting federal installations throughout the late 90s and the early 2000s. So this is obviously something that there should be concern about. And even relatively recently with the Trump administration, there were accusations from high-ranking government officials that in these devices were discovered, these Stingray devices that were sucking up all of this data from smartphones of people working at the White House. Those were linked to Israel as well, but no investigation was launched. Of course, if you're familiar with Trump's relationship with Israel, it's no surprise as to why that wasn't investigated. But this, by all appearances, they don't really seem to necessarily be behaving as the ally that people in the U.S. are often told. And it was actually from the Snowden leaks as well that there was a document produced saying that Israel is the most aggressive spy agency targeting the U.S. after Russia and China, ahead of Iran and a lot of North Korea and a lot of other countries that are, have a more adversarial relationship with the United States. So all of this is really significant. And the fact that they're openly admitting that these companies are being used as fronts for different operations is completely insane. And this admitted, we have the anti-BDS laws in the U.S., but we also have this tech angle to Israel's government's efforts to target BDS, which is, a huge violation of the First Amendment being actively done through means of espionage and other means to target, the First Amendment rights of Americans. It's honestly very scandalous.
And a lot of what you have just talked about with Cyber Reason and the other organization and breaking this down about Israel's national security state intersecting with that of the United States. You just did another interview with Loki, which can also be found on our YouTube channel. So I want to talk more about the World Bank. You mentioned that at the very beginning. In your article about TOCA, you break down how organizations like the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank are helping in the fight against Palestine and those that seek its liberation. I know you talked about the targeting of BDS, but can you break down how the World Bank is more specifically being used in this?
Yeah, so the World Bank partnered with Israel, as did the Inter-American Bank. They both had existing partnerships before, but there's a particular partnership with both of those banks that took place in 2019. And according to Haaretz, the Israeli media outlet that's I think one of Israel's oldest media outlets and most prestigious, they said that those contracts were part of an interministerial committee that was created by Netanyahu in 2019, with the purpose of it was to, quote, realize the potential of international development to strengthen the Israeli economy, improve Israel's political standing, and strengthen its international role, end quote. And one of the sources they cite in there, who was, according to them, chose to remain anonymous, but was directly very close to this entire undertaking, he said, quote, development banks are a way to help advance Israel's interest and agenda in the developing world, including Latin America, but it's not philanthropy. And of course, in the case of TOCA, what we've seen a year after those partnerships were forged is World Bank funded projects choosing TOCA to work directly with the government of Chile. And then in the case of the Inter-American Bank, having financing TOCA to work directly with the government of Nigeria. And these are if you go on TOCA's website, as I mentioned earlier, they make lots of sales, but they're not public. And these are the only clientele that they actively promote. And they sort of promote it as these sort of philanthropic cases. But as Haaretz noted, they're not philanthropic at all. They're aimed at something else. And this is important in the context of the use of the Israeli state in these contexts I mentioned earlier, specifically, efforts to target BDS, because, it seems to me anyway, and, people are welcome to disagree, but it seems like it's no coincidence that they would choose these two countries first among the developing world, because Nigeria historically has shown solidarity with Palestine. It is specifically in the last 10 years, except for one incident in 2014 where they abstained from an important vote at the UN. But even aside from their government, in terms of Nigeria's population, very significant and important solidarity for Palestine is shown there on a regular basis, not just when Israel commits obvious war crimes that get international attention in terms of the invasion of Gaza. And things like that. So, and of course, in the context of Chile, Chile has the largest Palestinian community outside of the Middle East. It has arguably the strongest BDS movement in the entire Americas. And actually, cities in Chile were declaring boycotts of Israel at the municipal level and at the local level. But then the current government, the far-right government of Sebastián Piñera, stepped in and said, no, this has to be implemented at the federal level. But there's actually like a Palestinian caucus in Chile's Congress that since 2018 has been drafting laws to institute a national level boycott of goods produced in Israeli settlements. And the most recent effort for that took place just this past June. So now with TOCA's involvement in this, it's questionable how far that will actually end up going. The more their services and their products become intermeshed with the government and the security agencies of Chile. And there's one thing that we didn't really get into quite yet, exactly who is behind TOCA, but it's very important to point out that this is the only tech company ever founded by former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Barak. Some people may remember during the Epstein scandal that Ehud Barak, of course, because of his close association with Epstein, his visits to his island, his visit to Epstein-owned apartment complexes that housed underage girls where Ehud Barak would spend the night and things like this. Of course, he got a lot of attention there, but also was the fact that Ehud Barak was the chairman and a leading investor in this company called Carbine 911, in which Epstein had also invested. That was also focused specifically on U.S. law enforcement agencies and emergency call services. So there was an overlap there and did have very concerning surveillance potential. But he didn't found that company. So he founded TOCA in 2018. And of course, if you're familiar with Ehud Barak's history, aside from the Epstein scandal, he's a former head of Israeli military intelligence. He's former minister of defense when Operation Cast Lead took place, targeting the Gaza Strip in 2009. That the chemical weapons were used against Palestinian civilians. Over 1,000 Palestinians were killed, in contrast to 12 or 11 Israeli deaths, and several deaths of Israelis were actually due to friendly fire, not to Palestinians at all. And has been, he's essentially a war criminal himself. So this is really his company. And given, the fact of with the Epstein scandal, the blackmail, the espionage connections there, and also his ties, Ehud Barak's ties to promoting the services of Black Cube to people like Harvey Weinstein, to target victims of sexual assault of his and things like that. This is not a guy with moral scruples. I really want to stress that, and it has associated with someone like Epstein, who was an intelligence asset acquiring blackmail for different states as well as for his own personal gain. So obviously, this is cause for concern when it relates to Toka. And then if you look at the other people that are employed by this company, it's like the former head of all cyber activity at the IDF, including for Unit 8200, very high-ranking Israeli military intelligence officials or people that develop the cyber strategy or offensive tools specifically for Netanyahu's office when he was prime minister and things like that. And as I mentioned earlier, they work directly with Israeli intelligence agencies, and they're part of this, 2019 agenda, as I mentioned earlier, to use development banks as a way to advance Israel's political agenda in foreign countries. This is a different type of scandal. Right. From what we're seeing with the NSO group and Pegasus, but no mainstream media outlet has touched it. And I actually, for Mint Press, and as the third installment of my series on cyber reason, I mentioned Toka, and there was, of course, no interest in looking any further there. Of course, I would like to think maybe that will change. But given mainstream media's avoidance of the issue of Israel's government or Unit 8200 in its entirety in relation to this these recent revelations about Pegasus, I am a little doubtful. But I think this just speaks to the larger problem of this market in its entirety and how Israel has tried to position itself at the front of that market and is obviously weaponizing it to go after political dissent, people who criticize its policies, and not just its policies, but its, even its flagrant violations of international law.
Absolutely. I mean, it's very clear that these are not just private endeavors. These are companies that the Israeli apartheid state is outsourcing to do its dirty work to promote its foreign policy and target dissent. I want to talk a little bit more about cyber reason. In your investigation, which you actually wrote another investigation for Mint Press about cyber reason, you just did a very wonderful interview with Loki and explained this as well. Who are cyber reason and what were they doing being employed to run doomsday scenarios for the 2020 election featuring, martial law being declared in the United States?
Yeah, so cyber reason first got my attention. I think it was in November of 2019, a year before the 2020 election, because they were running these very odd simulations with DHS, the U.S. Secret Service, at their offices, their U.S. offices in Boston, where they were essentially simulating cyber attacks against U.S. critical infrastructure and things like that, and seeing how law enforcement personnel in the U.S. were responding to those events and things like that. And, they have a very controversial background. As I mentioned earlier, the guy who runs it, Lior Div, says that his work at Cyber Reason is a continuation of his time in Unit 8200. I don't think it could be any more blatant in terms of these policies. So why is Israeli intelligence conducting those things? and specifically simulations about US electoral chaos and things like that. And of course, the 2020 election was quite chaotic, but not necessarily in the same way that Cyber Reason had simulated. But there were also other hints from not just this company, but within the US intelligence community that something in the 2020 election was going to create a huge explosion. And it was, of course, part of this broader pivot towards domestic terror that preceded the 2020 election. Of course, we've seen it since, with the January 6th and all of that, how that has turned out in terms of the policies now being implemented. But Cyber Reason there's a lot of reason to be concerned about them. One of the reasons is that one of their main partners is Lockheed Martin, which is a major US weapons manufacturer, of course, and also previously provided a lot of IT services to the US. And Cyber Reason software was integrated into every Lockheed Martin IT product. And of course, that branch of Lockheed Martin has since been acquired by Leidos, but Leidos is the biggest provider of IT services to the US government as a whole, and they continue to use Cyber Reason products. It's been said for years that the type of software that Cyber Reason sells, their cybersecurity software, that same model of software, in terms of it being weaponized with backdoors, is very common. This has been admitted in places like the New York Times and things like that. The U.S. Israeli intelligence has a history of using front companies to do exactly that. With the Promise software scandal, where Robert Maxwell sold backdoor software to intelligence agencies all over the world, as well as to classified U.S. national laboratories, so Israel could illicitly spy on the U.S. nuclear program during that period of time in the pursuit of its own undeclared but known at this point nuclear program. So, this is something that has gone on. And of course, even beyond, these quite telling statements from their CEO. The other co-founders are also from Unit 8200. They previously served in some of the companies involved previously in espionage against the United States I mentioned previously, like Amdocs and Converse Infosys, as some of their subsidiaries. So, honestly, this is quite significant in the context of some of these now admitted Israeli, intelligence and military policies that we've talked about. Why wasn't this vetted? Why was this just allowed to happen? And even beyond that, Cyber Reason has been allowed to contract to different aspects of the U.S. military in running on highly classified databases and things like that. The potential for espionage, and given some of these statements in the history of Israeli intelligence as a whole, is obviously really concerning. And why are they simulating? In addition to that, why are they simulating? With U.S. government agencies that would respond to those types of controversies in terms of hacks? About how martial law can be declared in the U.S. and other things like this. It's quite disturbing, especially when you take into context that essentially this merger that has gone over the past years between Israel's high-tech sector and the military is openly praised by U.S. neocons, including, Paul Singer, who I mentioned earlier, created Startup Nation Central. He's a major funder of Republican candidates, including Marco Rubio, just to name one. But one of the main, a big donor to the Republican Party. This is something that I think definitely deserves attention, because people in his orbit, like Dan Senor, who used to run the Foreign Policy Initiative with Robert Kagan and Bill Kristol, wrote a whole book praising the civil military fusion concept and saying that if the U.S. wants a better high-tech sector, they should essentially do that and follow the Israel model. Obviously that if you take it too far, quickly becomes a dictatorship. And, with this war on domestic terror that's being launched directly in partnership with governments like Israel and the Five Eyes countries, this is really a slippery slope we're on. And a lot of these issues aren't even being discussed, even in independent media, though I think part of that is because the news cycle is so much. But it's important to point out that mainstream media, though, there are obvious cases over the past several years where they create or publish stories that are false or intended to mislead. Oftentimes what's more damaging is their refusal to cover things, period, and allow things to just essentially be permanently memory hold or just totally kept out of the public's view. And so there really needs to be a big effort here to talk about this stuff, because it definitely doesn't look good. And of course, that initial 2019 simulation that Cyber Reason conducted wasn't their only one. They have come to do them quite regularly with all different types of high-ranking U.S. agencies and in different scenarios. I honestly think it's quite concerning, especially in the context of these focuses on hacks on critical infrastructure, when we're constantly being warned by the media that such hacks will take place and that governments like Iran will do it. And of course, if you remember back to the 60 Minutes interview given by then head of Mossad, Mayor Dagan, he was openly saying that Israel's government has been looking for ways to get the U.S. to attack Iran first, so Israel doesn't have to. We had to take all of this stuff into consideration, I think.
Absolutely. So that was a lot. That was a lot.
I tend to do that. Sorry.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I want to try to break it down a little bit more. I want to take one step back to Jeffrey Epstein. Last year you described Isabel Maxwell as Israel's backdoor into Silicon Valley. Isabel Maxwell is, of course, you've reported about her, the daughter of media baron and Israeli super spy Robert Maxwell, and the sister of the notorious sex offender Ghislaine Maxwell. Can you tell us a little bit more about her and about Robert Maxwell's spying for Israel? Because I think it's so important to, point these people out, because you can't talk about Israel's national security state and the emerging of the U.S. national security state without talking about these sex offenders.
Right. So in the case of Robert Maxwell, what happened there with the Promise software scandal is that he was picked by the head of the now defunct Israeli intelligence agency, Lakem. The head of that at the time was Rafi Eitan, who was the mastermind of this whole thing. He basically arranged the bugging, the insertion of a backdoor into this software that was revolutionary at the time in the context of managing government and intelligence databases, sort of a prototype to what Palantir is today in terms of its functionality. And so governments in different corporations and laboratories and things like this were very eager to use it. And it was actually developed by a former NSA contractor and was being used in the US and then was sort of stolen in what should have been a big scandal, but it was covered up by the Reagan administration. But this Israeli spy master, Rafi Eitan, essentially got wind of it and created a backdoor version of it that he had Robert Maxwell act as the salesperson for and go and market it around the world. To do that, Robert Maxwell created several front companies to do this. And the one he used in the US to sell it specifically to Los Alamos National Laboratories and some of these highly classified US laboratories, so Israel could spy on U.S. scientific and technology research with a focus specifically on the nuclear program. Both Isabel Maxwell and Christine Maxwell, his daughters, worked there, including in leadership positions. So they were actively involved in this front company. At the time that scandal was taking place, which is pretty significant. After his death in 1991, Isabel Maxwell openly admits that she essentially inherited his portfolio of Israeli intelligence contacts, including with people like Shimon Peres, former heads of Mossad, and people like that who we know even later on, she admits to having been close to. She started making regular trips between the U.S. and Israel. And as a way to sort of rebuild her father's legacy, she and her sister Christine created a company called Magellan, called the McKinley Group, but their first product, really, their main product was Magellan, which was sort of an early search engine for the internet. And that in 1995 made major deals with Microsoft specifically. And of course, Ghislaine Maxwell had a major stake in this company as well. So eventually it was sold to another company in 1996. Ghislaine Maxwell made a profit of that. It's not clear if that was used to finance the sexual blackmail activities she was conducting with Epstein at the time. But Isabel Maxwell was the vice president of that company and was directly responsible for establishing relationships between that company and large tech companies to get them to use Magellan's services. And one of those was Microsoft, and she apparently developed some sort of odd relationship with Bill Gates during that period, which she references later. Which is referenced later in an article in The Guardian in 2000. She starts talking about Bill Gates, and she normally sounds slightly British. She adopts a Southern Belle U.S. accent and starts to purr when talking about Bill Gates, according to the Guardian journalist of the time. It's pretty weird. But anyway, that is significant because in the context of the fact that after this company was sold in 1996, she was headhunted by a tech company whose product essentially ran in the background of email service providers, including later Microsoft's Hotmail, after another merger, essentially, or alliance, I guess you could say, with Microsoft, and that had been founded by veterans of the IDF. And they specifically wanted Isabel Maxwell to work there because she was Robert Maxwell's daughter. Of course, Robert Maxwell, having some of his biographers have referred to him as Israel's super spy, not just because of his involvement with Israeli intelligence, not just with the Promise software scandal, but a host of other things. And not just targeting the U.S., targeting various governments. So, all of this is pretty significant. And of course, he stole money from the pension fund of people that worked for media outlets he owned in order to finance Mossad activities in Europe, among other things. I mean, just tons of scandals with this guy. So they specifically seek out Isabel Maxwell because she is directly, the daughter of her father, and admits that she had inherited this portfolio of intelligence contacts from her father. And when she joins this company, which is called ComTouch, she says, "Oh yeah, I decided to join because it's an opportunity to continue my father's involvement in Israel." It's a direct quote from her. So that's pretty significant. So anyway, she goes along and forges major deals with Microsoft. It's actually Microsoft that puts ComTouch on the map, according to Isabel Maxwell, thanks both to the investments of Paul Allen and Microsoft at the last minute to prevent a collapse of their IPO. It's not very clear why they would invest in ComTouch, because before their IPO, they just recorded millions of dollars in losses every year. We didn't turn a profit and were considered as obscure software developer, but it was this involvement of Microsoft's co-founders that really led there to be some traction for this company that appears that it very easily could have been weaponized by Israeli intelligence services, given all the stuff that we talked about today. And thanks to this partnership with Microsoft, was running in the background and had access to all of the information passing through Microsoft's Hotmail servers, potentially allowing emails to be surveilled and spied on during that period. And of course, she later leaves and goes through a host of, running a host of different Israeli-based technology companies. But what's more interesting is that she later got involved in things like the Israeli Venture Network in the Shimon Peres Center and things like this, expressly in efforts to sort of further this policy I mentioned earlier to merge Israeli national security founded tech companies with Silicon Valley in the United States. So, she seems to be intimately involved in this particular policy that we've been talking about today with, former ministers of defense, former prime ministers of Israel, and was, recruited into this expressly to continue her father's involvement of Israel, which of course is a legacy of espionage.
Incredible web of people that you have brought together to expose Whitney. I really appreciate you joining us today to talk about both Pegasus and Toka and how they were developed by ex-spies and Israeli intelligence units like, 8200, who, both of these companies and software, these backdoor softwares, are basically being used as mass surveillance tools and being weaponized by the state of Israel to conduct its dirty work, to promote its foreign policy and to target dissent. And I think it's extremely concerning, as you very brilliantly laid out, that if we are truly to care about our civil liberties, our First Amendment rights of free speech, since this is being weaponized to also target BDS activism and any sort of dissent that is critical of US foreign policy and Israeli foreign policy, and the neoliberal establishment. So we really have to be concerned about all of these aspects and bring attention to the intersection of the Israeli national security state with the US national security state. Whitney Webb, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. I think these topics are really important to cover. And like I said at the end of my article for Mint Press, if people truly care about the implications of the NSO Group and Pegasus scandal, they should care about the entire market that markets tools like this. Pegasus is just one of many tools doing this, and just one of many tools that has been weaponized by the Israeli government for this express purpose. So we should definitely expand our concern to not just include Pegasus. So yeah, thank you for allowing me to bring this info to a wider audience.
Absolutely. And I just want to thank you, Whitney, for bringing attention to this, for covering this. And you did mention that not a lot of independent media outlets do cover this. Mint Press has been covering this through your help.
Well, I didn't include you in that at all.
Of course, yeah. through Whitney Webb's writing and investigations. And also you can find another interview that she did, I mentioned it a couple times, with Loki on our YouTube channel and on our website. And of course, this podcast is a video, it's available in video and also in audio format on iTunes and Spotify. So you can find this interview on our YouTube channel, on our website at mintpressnews.com, and also on Spotify and iTunes under Mintcast. Thank you all so much for joining us today.